Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Dyllon Explains Everything. My name's Dylan. In case you couldn't tell by the title, I'm the one explaining everything, including the topic of today, what makes Phineas and Ferb such a great show. Before we begin, I'd just like to start out with our word of the day, which is misnomer. M-I-S-N-O-M-E-R, misnomer. And it is described as an incorrect or unsuitable name. So basically, if you use the wrong word for something or the wrong term for something, that is a misnomer. So this episode is kind of like, not really a sequel episode, but related episode to my Phineas and Ferb episode that I did before this became a podcast. So you can only find it on YouTube, and it just kind of goes over some of my basic thoughts on Phineas and Ferb and describing exactly what the show is, but I'm going to get into a little more detail than that and more about the impact of Phineas and Ferb and what exactly makes it such a great show. So just so you have some basic backstory on Phineas and Ferb is a children's TV show, or at least that's how it's marketed. It appeared on Disney in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I don't know the exact dates off the top of my head, but it was made by two guys, Jeff Swampy Marsh and Dan Povenmire. They were the creators of the show, but they came from like very different points in life, right? So Dan Povenmire, he always worked on filming. He took up a job drawing people on the street after dropping out of college. And at that point, he started getting contacted to work on smaller projects with animation, slowly getting more important invitations to projects like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and eventually he was even working on The Simpsons. Jeff Swampy Marsh had gone into marketing for a computer company as his first job, but he decided to switch over to animation after he quit his job, and he was also invited to work on The Simpsons, and it was at this point that they met and began their kind of work together. So they had very similar senses of humor and tastes in music, and after working with The Simpsons together, they started working with Rocko's Modern Life together. It was at this point that Povenmire, while at a restaurant, drew a picture of a triangle kid on a piece of butcher paper. He immediately called Marsh that night, and they began working on a show. The problem was no one would actually air the show. They tried with many different stations and companies, but it just didn't work out. Marsh ended up moving to Britain to work on different animation projects, while Povenmire worked on shows like Family Guy and SpongeBob SquarePants. Povenmire pitched Phineas and Ferb to Cartoon Network, Fox Kids, and many other stations, but they deemed it too complex for kids. And this is kind of ironic because Disney finally called Povenmire and told him that they wanted to air Phineas and Ferb, and the show was praised for being more complex than the average kids show. Several jokes that appear throughout the show reflect this. For me, a joke that always flew over my head when I was younger, but became funny when I was older, was when the mother of Phineas and Ferb, Linda, was baking pies all night and started becoming delusional. The pies she bakes begin to stand up and sing a song, repeating over and over the numbers 3.141592, the digits of pi. As a kid, this was just some weird song they sang, but when I grew older, I realized the humor in it, and it actually pushed me to memorize 55 digits of pi. Another joke that was a lot more complex than regular kid shows was from the episode My Fair Goalie, where they explained the creation of Football X7. As a kid, I remember them discussing the professor that invented Football X7, named Professor Ross E. Thorpe. They would say later that he was forced into hiding because they discovered that his name was a palindrome. The joke here is that why would someone go into hiding because their name is a palindrome? It's kind of similar to like echoing like the Salem witch trials with like your name can't be a palindrome. But it was interesting for me because I was like, what does that word mean? And it actually taught me the word palindrome. In fact, the show taught me many words. Platypus, pharmacist, and aglet. Aglet has since kind of become a generational phenomenon. Most people in Generation Z will know what an aglet is. It's the plastic piece at the end of your shoelace or hoodie strings. And this is from Phineas and Ferb. Dan Povenmire actually said that when they were making the episode, he said that if they do the episode right, an entire generation of people would know the word aglet. And that's exactly what happened. People will host trivia game shows and stuff, or parties, and they have problems where every time there's a kid at a group, they will always get the question right. What is the name for the plastic at the end of your shoelace? Every kid knows it. So people will put it in these trivia like hangouts, and they'll always have people getting it right, and they think it's a super tricky question. It's not, because Phineas and Ferb taught us. So I think it just kind of goes to show that Phineas and Ferb is a bit more complex in its humor, and I think that appealed a lot to kids who didn't want to just watch basically a TV show that was just kids humor or just childish humor. They wanted to watch something that was a bit more older. But I think that there's a bit more to why the show thrived, and I think it has to do with our age or our life as we watch the show. You see, for me, I believe that entertainment reflects the viewer just as much as the viewer reflects the entertainment, right? So if I am watching comedies all the time, then I believe that it may mean that I am a more comedic person, or I might be the opposite, where I need more comedy in my life. What we watch is somewhat determined by who we are, and vice versa, right? Sometimes when we watch something, we will actually grow more humorous because we're watching comedies, or we will grow to depend on the humor within them, or whatever. There's a relationship between us and what we watch. We kind of are what we watch, and what we watch is us. And I think that Phineas and Ferb does a great job at reflecting us in many stages of life, right? So for kids are younger, and they are looking at the world through these kind of tinted eyeglasses, right? They believe the world is a bit of an idealized place where everything is great, sharing is caring, and all their needs are kind of mostly provided for most kids anyways, especially ones that would be watching a TV show. And when they watch the TV show, they see Phineas and Ferb, and it's kind of like what they want to be. It is an idealized form of themselves. They see these two kids who make the most out of every day they have freedom, right? No school, always with their friends, and always doing whatever they want. That kind of freedom and endless optimism, I think, is what we see when we are kids looking at the TV show. We may miss some of the witty humor or some of the more deep things within the show, but we see what we want our lives to be within the show. A perpetual summer of accomplishments with friends, an eternity of youth with no cares, worries, or unsolvable problems. Another thing I think Phineas and Ferb nails is dealing with serious topics, but in a way that we can actually understand and that we can actually look up to, right? So they show things, they don't shy away from complex topics, right? So divorce, remarriage, failure, bullying, stereotypes, and many societal issues are all addressed within the show, but they're resolved in a mature manner that we can't help but admire. It's idealized, yes, but it's what we want to see in it. And as a kid, you're mainly focusing on Phineas and Ferb and their friends and the problems they deal with and just how they deal with them. And you look up to that and enjoy that. But when you grow older, you start to move past that. You start to move past the idea of just entertainment and funny jokes and the blissfully energetic summer. You start to grow older and realize that this is a complex show, and there's complex problems within it. I think the older we get, and once we move past that kid stage onto the tween or early teen years, you start to see the show as more of a more for the witty humor, for the complex subjects, for the societal issues it does address and how it addresses them. You do see the idealized world. However, you might admire it more than when you were a kid. When you were a kid, you were somewhat living that world, but now you're at a point where you wish you could. And I think that is where the first change happens, and the show beautifully reflects how we feel about that, because you can start to see these issues in it that we didn't see when we were kids. Just like when we're kids, we don't see a lot of issues in the world, and as we grow older, we start to see them. But there's still that faint hope of optimism, right? That feeling that, like, this could be how we deal with things. I think that going back to the whole reflection thing, this is the beauty of Phineas and Ferb. We project our ideas onto it, and they're there for us to see perfectly. We see the world as we wish we could. It's possible we're watching Phineas and Ferb because part of us wants to become more like it. I do think that this is definitely something that could grow as we get older, but I think it's more likely that we're watching it because we see ourselves in it. And I think that it's not because it's perfect, because we aren't perfect, but it reflects our world within it, an idealized version of the world, but the world nonetheless. And I think that's part of the beauty of the show. And then time moves on, and we start to move past that early teen stage, and we start to see a big change. And I think that most people kind of agree that this is something that a lot of teenagers do. They start to become disillusioned to the world, right? They start to see the problems, and they start to see that a lot of them may be unsolvable or at least not easily solvable. And, this is a big shift, especially when you're watching a show where everything seems so perfect. As an illusioned kid blinded by an idealistic and overly positive view of the world, I saw the show as an amazing tale of two brothers and their friends enjoying every day to its fullest, living a life I wish I could. But when I grew older, I viewed Phineas and Ferb world as a more entertaining mixture of intelligent humor and fascinating characters teaching deep moral lessons and complex thoughts. But now we reach the stage where you become disillusioned, and you can't help but shift your focus away from Phineas and Ferb and focus on Dr. Doofenshmirtz. I could rant about Dr. Doofenshmirtz for hours. He is an amazing character, and this is part of the reason why. He is one of the most relatable, tragic, and lovable characters in the show. Yes, we definitely had our parents there at our birth, right? But a lot of people do have problems with their parents, just like Doofenshmirtz had. And this could be a number of things. Maybe the person watching the show, they had parents show up at their births, but not for the rest of their lives. Or maybe it's different parents. Or maybe there's just something else going on in Doofenshmirtz's life that you can relate to. His loneliness. Maybe you grew up without friends or being bullied constantly. Or maybe you feel that your sibling is the favorite and got special treatment. Or whatever. Doofenshmirtz had faced so much. And yet, he's still lovable. He had a childhood full of verbal, emotional, and borderline physical abuse. He had a teenage life full of rejection and heartbreak, and that led into an adult life categorized by divorce, failure, loneliness, and misunderstanding. And after having seen the horrors of the world more and more, we begin to see their representation within the show, and especially within Doofenshmirtz. Yet despite this, Doofenshmirtz remains one of the most beloved animated characters possibly of all time. His life can be categorized by a series of despites. Despite his traumatic childhood, he tries to give his child, Vanessa, one of the best childhoods that they could have. Right? He goes out of his way to try and make it better because he wants it to be better than his. And despite his constant heartbreak and eventual divorce, he never stopped looking for love. Despite his life of loneliness, he still managed to be an amazing friend to Perry the Platypus. Despite his negatives, he still carried life out in a positive and uplifting way. Even though he is evil, he's not actually evil. He's lovable. Most of his problems are completely relatable, and sometimes his evil inventions don't even seem that evil. They just seem mildly amusing, or maybe slightly annoying to the person they're targeting, but overall, not really evil. I don't think he would ever actually be classified as evil, except in the fact that he wants to be. This is the genius behind his character and Phineas and Ferb as a whole. It's not ignoring the problems of life. It doesn't shy away from the horrible things within the human experience, but rather it shows us how to live in response to these things. The show thrives because we see ourselves in it, but in the best way it can be. It is possible people mainly watch the show for nostalgia's sake. However, I believe many people watch the show because it matches them. The full picture is that we are complex individuals, constantly changing, and yet the show presents multiple facets to explore different parts of the human experience along different stages of life. I think that we can look throughout our stages in life and we can see ourselves reflected in the show, or what we may have seen in the show. The overly optimistic child who just wants to live every day free and fulfilling. and then you move into the more complex human in the in-between stages of life, where they're not quite disillusioned to the world, but they're definitely old enough to understand some of the complexities of it. And then you reach the point where you're disillusioned, and the rest of your life you're left with all these problems that you realize you may have had or you are having, and you face them more and more, and you can see them in the show and understand the proper way to react to it. You can see a form of entertainment before you in which problems happen, but people can deal with them in the best way possible. Therefore, the show reflects who you are in life, just like it reflects who I am in life and where I am. Where I focus on is completely dependent upon where I am, and it's possible that my view will change again. I don't know. But now I watch it with nostalgia, appreciation, and respect. It remains one of the best shows reflecting our journey through life, the complexities of the human experience, and gives us a glimpse into who we are, what matters to us, and where we are in life. I would rate Phineas and Ferb a 9.5 out of 10 if I could. And I do. So I hope that you all can kind of see the complexities within Phineas and Ferb and get a greater appreciation for just how great the show is because of this episode. And I also hope that maybe if you don't necessarily like Phineas and Ferb, or you haven't seen it, maybe you can see similarities between what I've said about Phineas and Ferb and the kind of shows you watch. Because I believe entertainment as a whole kind of represents this, that we see ourselves within it, and that we see different things depending on what stage of life we are. And I think that's what can make a really great show. Some shows are very one-sided, right? A lot of kids shows especially. You watch it, and you're just watching a kid's show. If you're not a kid, you probably won't find much of it very funny. And then you look at like more mature shows and stuff, and it's like if a kid watched it, they would get nothing out of it. And at certain stages of life, you get nothing out of it. The greatest thing that you could have in a form of media is the ability to watch it at different points in life and find it relatable every single time. So that's my thoughts on why Phineas and Ferb is great. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know it was a bit different in style than my previous ones. It was not really an analysis of Phineas and Ferb, but a bit more of like a connection. And I want to kind of start underlining that in my episodes more. A connection between what I'm talking about and your life, and maybe similar subjects. I do want to explore subjects and educating people on them, and I definitely think this isn't the end of Dyllon explaining things, and now we're on to Dyllon connecting things. But I definitely think that part of explaining and understanding things is being able to connect it to your own life. So I'm going to try and do that more. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and stay tuned for next week's episode. I have an idea of what it's going to be, but it's going to be a lot. I might do a bit of a longer episode that time. So let me know in the comments below what you thought of this episode. Be sure to like and subscribe and comment and all that stuff. And if you have any ideas or anything like that, stories you want me to read, whatever, just email me at dyllonexplaineseverything@gmail.com. And without further ado, my name's Dyllon, and I explain everything.